Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever it is you happen to be. Hey guys, I hope you're having a great week, and I hope you guys are interested in world wars, because today we are going to be talking about a conflict that, when it happened, was not called World War One. Obviously, it wasn't called that until World War Two occurred. We'll get there. But rather, it was known as the War to End All Wars. And there is no argument that World War II was more devastating by sheer numbers of people dead, civilian and otherwise. World War II eclipses World War I. I mean, there was something like 70 million or so civilians and war combatants who were killed, and that doesn't even include folks who were injured. World War I, you have about 10 million, and that's a fairly sizable number. But the reason I say that is because in many ways I view World War I as being a bit more climactic. At least I think it was more climactic in the consciousness of people who lived through it and then attempted to make sense of it. There was, of course, folks who, many authors and what have you, authors, musicians, artists, who during the 1920s were trying to make sense of what had just happened. I mean, what World War I did is it ruptured perceptions of reality. Folks thought that humanity was progressing forward, and in many ways, World War I demonstrated a forward progression of humanity. You look at the technological advancements of World War I, you look at things like the weaponry of World War I, and you very quickly understand that humanity had progressed with respects to technology, but the sheer destruction of World War I that was wrought upon Europeans, predominantly because the lines of the war were fairly stagnant, located in Western France, between the border France-Germany. And I think for a lot of folks, they were disillusioned about what humanity had done. One of the things you need to understand is that although wars had taken place, there had definitely been some climactic conflicts. But ever since the fall of Napoleon, there hadn't been any like super major, huge world conflict. I mean, there's definitely issues. Don't get me wrong. There's wars. I mean, obviously you could say, well, how about the U.S. Civil War, for example? That was climactic. Sure. But World War I was something completely distinct and new. And so when we talk about World War I, especially in the United States, I think it's difficult for us as Americans here in the U.S., as U.S. citizens, to really grasp our minds around it, because it wasn't a conflict that the United States was very much a part of. The war starts in 1914 and it continues on until 1918. There's an armistice that is going to take place on November 11th at 11 a.m. That's why to this very day, 11/11/11, the 11th month of the 11th day, on the 11th hour, the guns of World War I fell silent. There was an armistice. But the final treaty which comes to end World War I, it's known as the Treaty of Versailles. It is a very significant treaty that you're going to need to be aware of because in many ways it sort of sets the stage for World War II. In many ways, World War II is a continuation of the conflicts that were created out of and by World War I. So technically, the war ends in 1918 with the passing of the treaty. Fighting stops in 1918. The United States doesn't get involved. We don't declare war until 1917. So the war had been going on for quite some time before the United States ever even got involved, and we'll talk about why that is, but for the most part, the United States attempted to remain isolationists. That is, they wanted to be isolated from the conflicts that were going on in Europe. And many people falsely and wrongly believed that in the early 20th century, the Atlantic Ocean was enough to keep us isolated from what was going on in Europe. And the reality is that's just not the case. The United States had a lot of things tying us to the war, and I'll make mention of those things here in a second. But to understand World War I, you really have to understand some things that were going on in Europe at the time, and try to pinpoint some of the central causes for World War I. And those causes are centralized in Europe. They are centralized in an area known as the Balkans. And so I just want to briefly mention what some of those causes were. First and foremost, we can see that nationalism played a very important role and a distinct role. Again, I'm looking at my notes. Nationalism played a distinct role in bringing about World War I. Nationalism, of course, is this idea that you take pride in your particular nationality. But what's going on at this time is that you have an empire known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it has conquered a huge swath of territory, and there were numerous nationalities that were subsumed underneath this one Austro-Hungarian Empire. But nationalism in some of these areas, particularly in an area known as Bosnia and Herzegovina, they are Slavic in nationality. And the people in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they don't want to be part of Austria-Hungary anymore. Instead, they want to be part of Serbia, because Serbia is predominantly Slavic. And so there's this intense struggle towards identification with your own nationalism, with your own nationality, and it brings about tensions as people in the region of Bosnia and Herzegovina create problems for Austro-Hungary. And really, the place where World War I is going to start is right in the Balkan states. It's actually referred to as the powder keg, because all you needed was one little match to set off the gunpowder that was there, you know, the pressure that had built up. And World War I will actually begin when Austria-Hungary declares war against Serbia. And so a lot of the tensions that bring about World War I start right in those Balkan states. And it has to do with tensions over nationalism. Now, that's just one tension. There are other factors involved. Another major factor that was involved was militarism. And militarism is, broadly speaking, as far as World War I goes, to sort of boil it down, there was an armament race between various powers in Europe. Specifically, we're talking about Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm and that of Britain. And what's basically happening is you've got these two powers that are seeking to build up their navy, and Germany and England begin to build very powerful battleships. And of course, the question is, why are you building up your military? What's the purpose of having a very strong navy, except unless you intend to use it? And so militarism very much creates a tense situation in Europe. So start thinking of this like a math problem. You have nationalism plus militarism, right? And you're beginning to see a formula put together that in the end is going to equal war, right? So you've got nationalism, you've got militarism. Another very important factor in bringing about World War I is also imperialism. Many European powers began to imperialize places like Asia and Africa, and as they sought to gain access to raw materials, as these European nations sought to gain access to new markets to sell their industrialized goods, they begin to compete with one another over land. And so imperialism is another factor. But there is one additional thing that you need to be aware of, and that is a significant system of alliances that's stacked up. As I've written here in my notes, it says countries throughout the world have always made mutual defense agreements with their neighbors, treaties that could pull them into battle. These treaties meant that if one country was attacked, the allied countries were then bound to defend them, okay? And this is precisely what happens. Prior to World War I, Europe really gets broken up into two distinct sets of alliances. The first is called the Triple Entente, and the Triple Entente is made up of Russia, the United Kingdom, and France. And then you've got the Triple Alliance, and the Triple Alliance is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Italy will eventually bow out of the Triple Alliance, but you have these two groups, you know, and it's kind of like if you ever got in a fight at school, right? It wasn't your fight. It's like your buddy got in a fight with this other person. And so since these two got in a fight, all of your friends come in to help, and all their friends come in to help, and now it's turned into a brawl. That's kind of what happens here. So in 1914, when Austria-Hungary declares war against Serbia, Russia then comes in to help Serbia because Russia was allied with Serbia. And then Germany came in to help Austria-Hungary. And you can just see how the dominoes begin to fall. And ultimately, what turned from a conflict in the Balkan states now turns into a world conflict. Now, the thing that sets this all off is the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was going into Sarajevo. There was a organization there called the Black Hand. They do not like the Archduke, who is ultimately an image of a man who's oppressing these folks in Sarajevo. And so he and his wife are assassinated. And so this sets off a chain reaction. World War I will erupt in Europe, and when it does, the United States basically maintains a position of neutrality, a position of isolationism. In fact, Woodrow Wilson, who is president of the United States at this time, he says and wants the United States to be neutral in thought and action. In other words, what he says is not only are we not going to fight in this war, but we're not going to even choose sides in our minds, right? We're not even going to pick a side that we want to win. Now, that's problematic for the United States, and part of the reason for it is because of the number of immigrants who have come into the country. And many of the immigrants who have come into the United States have ties back to Europe, right? Dr. Foner states the following: as war engulfed Europe, Americans found themselves sharply divided. British Americans sided with their nation of origin, as did many other Americans who associated Great Britain with liberty and democracy, and they associated Germany with repressive government. On the other hand, German Americans identified with Germany, right? And so what you have are groups of folks who are obviously going to take sides with their mother country, with their home country, with their country of origin. And not to mention, and this is really important, the United States has economic ties to Europe. Right? Just because Europe went to war doesn't mean now all of a sudden the United States has decided to cut off commerce with the rest of the world. That's not what's happening here. So it is not feasible for the United States to remain neutral. And eventually our neutrality is going to be tested time and time again. You're going to see this. Germany, as they are fighting a war, especially when they're trying to deal with the British blockade, they begin a process of engaging in what we call unrestricted submarine warfare. And they begin to basically blow up any ship that comes across their path. And that's deeply problematic because what they're doing is blowing up a lot of American ships, and we are a neutral nation. Probably the most famous ship to be blown up is the Lusitania, which was blown up in 1915. Now, quite often, students will state that the blowing up of the Lusitania caused the United States to go to World War I, and that's not true. It's a cause, but it wasn't the cause, right? The Lusitania is blown up in 1915. We don't get involved until 1917. Much of what causes us to get involved in World War I is continued unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany. And then there's also this letter that was written known as the Delaune Letter, where effectively Germany was trying to make an alliance with Mexico to invade the United States. And if they were successful, then Germany would give back to Mexico lands that the United States had taken during the Mexican-American War. That letter was intercepted. And so all of these things come together to ultimately bring the United States into the conflict. But I will tell you that as the war progresses, not only do the horrors of war demonstrate how technology has advanced, there begins to develop in the United States a real hatred for anything German. In fact, there came a point when universities would no longer even teach the German language. And, you know, they changed the name of Frankfurter, which is a German sausage, to hot dog or what have you, right? I mean, there's a real push against Germans and German people. Now, as far as Woodrow Wilson is concerned, one of the reasons why he wants to go to war, and he makes this very clear, is he says he wants to make the world safe for democracy. One of the things that you need to understand about Woodrow Wilson is that he believes that autocratic governments caused World War I. And it's not so much that the German people or the Ottoman Empire or what have you, it's not so much that they themselves want to fight this war, it's that you had autocratic leaders at the top who forced war upon these people. And so what Wilson wants to do is he wants to fight this conflict. And one of the things you need to understand about Wilson is he recognizes that no one can claim victory at the end of this war. If any nation is able to claim to be a victor, then that's just going to create tensions. And so he says, look, we need to make the world safe for democracy. And in the end, we need a war where no one wins, where we all just sort of end this conflict, right? To accomplish this, Wilson's going to devise what has now come to be called the 14 points. And after the war comes to an end, and there's the Paris Peace Conference, and that takes place in 1919. That's going to be the conference that will bring about the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson sort of issues these 14 points. And we'll talk more about that throughout the week, but a lot of his 14 points had to do with things like freedom of the seas, right? Dearmament. But his most cherished point was number 14, and that was the creation of a League of Nations. And the League of Nations was this organization that was supposed to come together where countries would speak about their problems, discuss their problems diplomatically, instead of blowing each other up with machine guns and poison gas and tanks and flamethrowers and all these other wonderful toys that have now been introduced during battle. And so the League of Nations is ultimately adopted, but not by the United States. The United States actually chooses not to join the League of Nations. In fact, the United States chooses not to sign the Treaty of Versailles because it is the conviction of many senators that if we sign our names to the Treaty of Versailles, then anytime a European conflict comes up, then the United States is going to get sucked right into it. And there's some truth in the matter of that. For those of you who think that the League of Nations sounds somewhat like the United Nations or the UN, then you would be correct. The United Nations replaces the League of Nations after World War II. But World War I is a climactic conflict, not only for the United States on the home front, not only for the soldiers who went and fought with Pershing on the Western Front in France, but for the whole world. And people were trying to figure it out. Now, I will end by saying this, and there was so much I didn't get to say here, but the Treaty of Versailles does not bring about a lasting peace. In fact, what the Treaty of Versailles does is it punishes Germany to such an extent that it creates pressure and tension that ultimately will boil over into World War II, and we'll talk more about that as well. One final thing I will state here, and this is significant because it is kind of important for what happens to the United States and Russia or the Soviet Union following World War II, is that in 1917, the government in Russia crumbles. The Tsar and Tsarina are killed. In fact, their entire family is assassinated. And Lenin and communism will begin to take root. In fact, when this happens in 1917, it actually bodes very well for Germany, because if you think about the alliance system, you've got Russia on one side, France and Britain on the other, and you've got Germany right in the middle. Germany was forced to fight a war on two different fronts. When Russia pulled out of the war in 1917, all these German troops could now sweep down into France, and it was very important for the United States to get involved because we threw about 2 million troops or so into the fight in 1917, 1918. It wasn't as if we were sending the Navy SEALs in. These weren't like the top fighting forces that were out there fighting, but 2 million people is 2 million people. But when that happens, a new government sets in Russia, and that government, of course, is going to be somewhat problematic for the United States following World War II, but I get ahead of myself just a little bit. There's so much to say about this conflict. I've already gone over. We're almost to 20 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and stop there. But, think deeply about this conflict. World War I is incredibly important. And even though the United States didn't spend a whole lot of time fighting it physically, its consequences were great. So, if you have questions or comments or concerns, let me know. I'll get back to you. Otherwise, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a great week, everybody.